everybody! Today we're going to be varnishing a painting. We will be using Golden Brand's Isolation Coat and MSA Varnish. The MSA Varnish is a mineral spirit acrylic varnish, so you do need Golden's MSA solvent to dilute it. The varnishing process is a two-part process that gets completed over the course of 2 days, so let's get started. First, let's protect our workspace by putting down a piece of plastic. I am then going to wipe off any extra dust or anything on the surface of my painting, and I'm going to clean out my container that I will be pouring my isolation coat into. We want to make sure that everything is super clean because we don't want any dust or any pet hairs or anything getting into our isolation coat. Even though the isolation coat comes pre-mixed, I like to give it a good stir just for good measure. It's not absolutely necessary on this part of the process to wear protective gloves. I didn't in this video, but later on when we go to the varnishing part of the process, you will want to use nitrile gloves to protect your skin from the solvent-based products. The isolation coat is a water-based product, so it easily cleans up with soap and water and isn't as harsh a chemical as the varnish. I'm not wearing nitrile gloves in this video because I didn't have any on hand. I grew up varnishing all my paintings with a water-based varnish that Golden Brand used to make. I've only been using this MSA varnish for the last few years, and I'm still not used to having nitrile gloves on hand for varnishing. These little plastic containers are sold at the grocery store, and they usually carry lunch meat. I always save these and put them aside for when I'm going to varnish a painting. Both of these brushes I got at Hobby Lobby. They are synthetic bristles, so the bristles are very soft, but I always get a 1, 2, or 3-inch brush for varnishing. I'm going to wipe out my container one more time, this time with a wet paper towel, just to ensure it is completely lint and dust free. Next, we are going to pour our isolation coat into our container. This is the preferred method rather than pouring it directly on your canvas, and let me explain why. It's important to load up your brush with the isolation coat. You want to get all of the bristles covered with the isolation coat so that when you apply it onto your painting, the bristles are what's pushing it onto your canvas and giving it a nice, solid, even coat. As you can see, the isolation coat will go on cloudy, but it will dry clear. It's important to avoid leaving behind any large streaks, but as you can see here, the little streaks left behind from the brush strokes are completely fine because it will dry clear. I make sure to work from one side to the other, covering one section at a time. When you do this, do not go back over the previous sections. It can result in a very uneven coverage. And this is how it looks when you finished applying the isolation coat. It looks like there's a cloudy film covering the painting, but you don't have to worry about this because it will dry and be clear and very, very shiny. Alright, here we are on day 2 of the varnishing process. It's been over 24 hours since the isolation coat was applied, so it is time to apply the varnish. Here are the tools we're going to need for the varnishing process. I'm able to use the same container as before because the isolation coat cleans up easily with soap and water. So I just cleaned out the container and let it dry really well, and I of course cleaned out my brush really well. To measure out the varnish, I usually use tablespoons, either a tablespoon, a teaspoon, or a half teaspoon, sometimes even smaller if I'm doing an even smaller amount. The ratio for the MSA varnish is 3 parts varnish to 1 part solvent. In my experience with the MSA varnish, it is very thick. It tends to go on thick even when it is diluted with the 1 part solvent. So mixing a little bit more rather than a little bit less will be helpful. I usually start by putting the solvent in first, and then I will be pouring the varnish in 1 scoop of solvent to 3 scoops of varnish. Now, this isn't an exact science necessarily, so it's okay if these margins are off by a tiny bit, but we try to get them as close as possible. Also, for reference, I am varnishing an 8x10 painting, and I used 3 teaspoons of varnish and 1 teaspoon of solvent. Next, I like to use the varnishing brush to mix the varnish and the solvent together. You want to take your time at this stage because if you mix it too quickly, you will get a lot of bubbles in your varnish, and you want to avoid that as much as possible. You inevitably will have little tiny air bubbles in the varnish, as you will see, but you mostly just don't want any large bubbles. So really take your time, brush slowly, mix the varnish together very slowly, very thoroughly. I usually spend at least 3 to 5 minutes just mixing the varnish with the solvent, and then sometimes I'll even let it sit for a little bit just to make sure that the bubbles have time to dissipate. Here's a close-up. It's kind of hard to see because the varnish is quite clear, but you can see there's not a lot of bubbles in the varnish, and so that is exactly what we want. When your varnish is mixed thoroughly, now it is time to apply it to our painting, and this is exactly like when we applied the isolation coat. Now, the varnish is a lot thicker in consistency than the isolation coat, so you will see you still want to load it up onto your brush, make sure your bristles are coated thoroughly, and then we will apply it just like we applied the isolation coat. I like to go in long strokes, going from one side to the other instead of random strokes going back and forth. I also like to work this going from one end to the other and not going back to brush over the previous brushes that I've already put down, the previous brush strokes that I've put down. So once you have a nice solid coat on there, try to work in one area and then move on to the next area without coming back to the previous areas. It's also very important to make sure you mix enough varnish to cover your entire piece. It's not pleasant to have to mix more varnish halfway through varnishing a piece. I like to go through and kind of tap the edges of my piece because sometimes it will drip a little bit down the sides. And this is how it should look when the varnish coat is complete. As you can see, there's little bubbles in the varnish. The bubbles of that size you do not have to worry about. This is going to dry perfectly. After you've finished applying the varnish, always make sure to look at your piece at an angle so you can make sure that you haven't missed any spots and that you have an even coat over the whole piece. And this is how it should look when your varnish is dry. This has been 24 hours since we applied the coat of varnish. As you can see, it is not super shiny anymore. This is a satin sheen, which in my opinion is the best for artwork. Not too flat and not too glossy. And just a little tip for cleaning up, if you have a lot of leftover varnish, you can always put it in a sealed container and then hopefully use it within the next week or so. But in this case, since I only had a little bit left, I just left it in the bottom of this tray and I let it dry over the next couple days. When it was completely dry, I could just dispose of this container like I would any other plastics. And as for your varnishing brush, it's really important to clean it really thoroughly with the solvent. Your brush should be good as new once you have it cleaned out. All right, that is how we varnish our paintings. After you apply the varnish, you want to wait 24 hours before touching your painting, and you want to wait at least a week if you're going to be shipping your painting. So you have to give yourself a lot of time in advance before you do this. If you have any questions or comments, please leave me a comment down below, and thank you guys for watching.